Slides, 10 minutes. Time starts now.
So this week we are going to be looking at assumptions, I hear, John. Am I making an ass out of you and me? You not heard that?
I have heard that, and you've just stolen one of my slides.
Oh.
So 1910 now. I'm only joking. All good. All good. So don't say anything else. Or you're gonna steal more of my content. No, because we talked about risk management before, right? And I thought it'd be good to have a conversation about assumptions while we're here as well. So let's just do let me just see if I can share my screen. There we go. Can you see my screen there? Is that looking all right? Yeah, looking like a deck. Magic. Happy days. So assumptions management, risk management's neglected cousin. Let's go. Have we started the clock? Yep, started the clock. Good. Okay, so let's start with the definition. Let's start with the basics. Assumption is a factor in the planning process considered to be true, real, or certain, but without proof or demonstration of that. So it's something that we're coming up with as a statement that we don't know if it's true. We're just kind of assuming it is true for now. If I've done rollouts of new computers in the past, where we made the assumption that an engineer can roll out 10 PCs a day to people, and then you test that assumption later on. We've done assumptions where we're running a project that is supposed to increase revenue for the business, and we make an assumption about how changing the website, making it faster, will increase people, that will reduce the number of people we lose in that funnel. All of these are assumptions that we're making as part of our projects. And as Lindsay so rightly said, we tend to kind of break it down to this sort of thing where assumptions make an us out of you and me. It's me in the bottom, that's you up there. There we go. Because these are things that trip us up time and time again. We make these assumptions, and if we're not explicit about those being assumptions, and if we don't then go through and actually test those assumptions, they can really bite us further down the line. Where do our assumptions live? Well, we all have these. Well, our project managers definitely all have RAID logs somewhere, which invariably, no matter what PPM system we're using, Shane, whether we are using Smartsheet or anything else, it invariably tends to be a spreadsheet that somebody's got somewhere with 4 tabs in there for their risks and their assumptions and their issues and their dependencies in there. And what we quite often see with this, that whilst we have these RAID logs floating around, we tend to sort of end up more with this kind of thing going on, right? There's a focus on the risks and the issues, and less on the assumptions and dependency. The way the project manager's busy, those are always the ones that kind of drop and we go quiet on. And if you look at project management reports, they tend to have the top 3 risks, top 3 issues, but we don't tend to have the assumptions in there very much. And if you go up to the program and portfolio level, we don't tend to talk about them at all. It's all about the risks, which is interesting. So yeah, kind of poor cousin of risk there, and just have a little play around with that, because somebody quite rightly challenged and spoke to Lindsay earlier online and said, well, actually, why do we bother with assumptions? Because isn't an assumption just a risk? Can't you just reframe it as a risk and dump it into your risk log? So if I'm making an assumption, to go back to my example of, let's imagine I'm assuming that my project can produce 10 widgets a day. For example, I can roll out 10 widgets a day. I'm making that assumption. I can convert that into a risk and say that there is a risk that we might not be able to do 10 a day. And then I can put a risk mitigation strategy around it. So then I'm straight into how can I avoid, reduce, transfer, contingency, accept, those kind of things. And I can plot it on my probability impact matrix here exactly as I do with a risk. And that feels like it makes sense, right? I can take an assumption, reword it, and make it into a risk. Yeah, and that's probably why the assumption log kind of disappears, because we sort of say we can cram it into the risk log, and then I'm only dealing with one artifact. And the problem with that is that the way we manage an assumption is different to the way we manage risks. The strategies are different. So whereas with our risks, we're looking at these strategies here, with our assumptions, we're looking at it more in terms of a scientific method to validate whether our assumption is true or false. So we're saying our assumption is basically a hypothesis that we're making. We're saying we believe that. We believe that we can do 10 of these a day. We believe that the chief technology officer will sign off on this piece of work. We believe that the project that's going to move everything to the cloud will be finished before we come in and do our bit. We believe procurement's going to work and deliver stuff on time for us. All these kind of things that we make assumptions of are basically hypotheses that we're creating. And we've got an assumption, our hypothesis, I'm struggling with the word hypothesis, which is not very helpful when we've got 10 minutes to go through this. So we've got these hypotheses, which are our assumptions, and they're things that we need to understand and learn about if our projects are going to succeed. And ideally, these hypotheses should be things that are testable. So is this something we can say is either true or false? Can we say, is there a way of saying, yes, we've confirmed that we can do that, or no, we can't do it? So is it testable? Is it precise? Have we clearly defined what good looks like? So in my example, I want to be able to do a lot of widgets a day is not very helpful. I want to be able to do 10 a day is nice and precise. And lastly, are my hypotheses discrete? So do I have one thing that I want to test? So we want to get those assumptions to be framed as hypotheses and have those to be testable, precise, and discrete. Why do we want to do that? Very, very simply, because rather than putting them into a risk log and looking at how we avoid and reduce and transfer, we want to run experiments. Experiments is not a risk strategy. Experiments is our assumption strategy. We take our assumptions and we run experiments to test whether our assumption holds up. Is this true? Is it false? Does our hypothesis stand up in real life? In the same way that we have our risk management matrix, where we look at probability and impact, here we've got something slightly different. We're looking at, and this is probably not the wording you might use in your organization, but we're basically saying for each of our assumptions, for each of our hypotheses, how important is it to our program or to our project? Is this something where if this hypothesis is wrong, it's going to blow our whole business case and it's not worth doing the project? Or is it something that's a minor inconvenience for us that we can get around? Where does it plot on that axis? And the other way, how much evidence do we have backing up this assumption that we're making? Do we have no evidence whatsoever? We've just gone out on a limb and said, that feels about right. Or do we have quite a lot of evidence? Maybe we've got experienced people in the team who've estimated it, and we've got a series of people that are backing us up on this and senior people that have done this before. So what's the amount of evidence that we've got? And what we're really looking at here, in the same way that we've got our high highs on a risk matrix, here we're looking at the super important ones where we don't have any evidence. And that's where we want to be running experiments to test our hypotheses, because those in that red space there are the ones that are going to bite us. And they will bite hard unless we run experiments to test those assumptions and validate them. All good so far? Happy days. Now, where we do see assumption logs is in our projects. Where I very rarely see assumption logs is with our portfolios. So all of you people out there running portfolios, why don't you have assumption logs for your portfolios? You have risk logs for the portfolio. We don't seem to have assumption logs. Yeah, something to think about. So there's two things here when we talk about portfolio assumptions. Firstly, what assumptions are we making about the portfolio holistically? So can we deliver everything that we said we will this year? We're making that, the senior leadership team often make that assumption at the start of the year. How true is that? And another great one, we make the assumption that we do not need to build a capability in for unexpected work during the year. We can fill the year 100% with projects because nothing new will come in. Some of these are quite fun to call out explicitly during planning. To say, it sounds like we're making this assumption. Are we agreeing with this one? What's the evidence we've got from last year that backs us up on this one? Did we get new things coming in through the year? If so, how much capacity should we carve out for those? The other way to look at the portfolio side is what assumptions our project teams are collectively making that affect the portfolio. Project managers are probably okay at tracking holidays for Christmas and things, but are they all collectively making an assumption that everything BAU around them will work okay? Quite often that's where they might fall down. Are they making an assumption that they can all onboard suppliers quickly? Does that hold? If you look at a big program where you might be onboarding a lot of people at once, can the normal business processes stand up to those? Project managers individually with 1 or 2 people making an assumption, fine. Looking at it on the portfolio level, you might say, actually, I'm not sure those assumptions stack up. And the last one there, that we can spin things up quickly in the cloud, or those kind of things. How true are these things? So we're looking at the portfolio as a whole, but also the collective, the sum of the assumptions that project managers are making as well. And the last thing that's really, really important here, I think, is shining a light on assumptions. The more, like risks, like everything else, that sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more we can share these things and communicate them with people, the more we can test them out. Even if we're not doing big experiments, just putting these assumptions explicitly in front of your sponsor or senior leaders or CTO may often get somebody turning around and saying, oh, no, that's never going to work. That's never going to fly. Making them visible gets you answers to them even without you doing experiments in some cases. So that was the 10 in 10. In a nutshell, think about your assumptions as hypotheses, focus on the ones that are the super important and low evidence on the matrix, make them highly visible because sunlight is the best disinfectant, conduct experiments rather than building risk mitigation strategies because they are different approaches. And remember, assumptions are important at the portfolio level too. So go away and have a think about what those are in your organization, how you can capture them and how you can then communicate them and reduce risk because you've solved your assumptions. That's me.